I appreciate that introduction, Terry, but we have a lot to cover. Maddie and I are going to work together to talk to you about marijuana in the developing brain, what today's parents need to know. As a pharmacist and as a soon-to-be pharmacist, Maddie and I are medication safety experts, and this is the purpose of what we're going to talk about is the concerns about marijuana and especially the high concentration dose marijuanas that we're talking about. So I titled this The Dangerous Drug Use Trends in America, marijuana being one of those. The information that also I'm going to share with you is from my friend and associate, Dr. Susan Weiss, who is the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse in the Division of Extramural Research. She is one of the leading researchers in the country as it relates to the use of marijuana and the concerns that the science world has about the use of marijuana in adolescents, young brains, in women, especially pregnant women and other circumstances. So we're going to talk a little bit about that research tonight. And if we begin, I'll show you a picture and back in the 1980, if I was going to have a marijuana talk, we would talk about this. We would talk about a joint, and we'll talk about a bong, and we'll talk about these different things. Because in the 80s, we had marijuana, and it's been around since for thousands of years. In the US, it's been around for hundreds of years. But when we talk about it tonight, it's a much different format. It's a much different look in what I'm seeing in the use of marijuana. These are high concentrated differentiations of marijuana. And not only that, do we not just have joints, we have dabs, and now we have vapes. And all of those things change the chemical outcomes of how the brain is affected by that. So we're going to discuss that somewhat because this thing about marijuana, it is not a 3 to 4 or 5% marijuana anymore, as we will discuss. And then I'm going to have Maddie. Maddie's going to talk about the dynamics, the pharmacodynamics and the pharmacokinetics of THC itself, just so people know what the medication and the drug in itself does to this particular human body that we have. So again, the slide that I show you comes from Dr. Weiss, and she talks about the research, and this was news for me actually when she shared it with us. We now know that the plant contains about 120 cannabinoids. That is pretty remarkable of the different types that we have. But we have to also understand that it is continually to be an illegal substance under federal law. It's legal for medical use in 36, and I think now up to 38 states and DC. It's legal for adult use in at least 18 to 20 states in DC. And then you can use low THC products in 11 states, such as in Georgia, and the medical guidelines, and then CBD and other things that we talk about. But the thing also is that we have active approved FDA drugs such as Marinol and Syndos and Setamet and Sativix, which should be approved by the end of the year. And of course, the CBD 100%, 99.9% oil Epidiolex. But the thing about it is, it is there and it's legal. But again, there seems to be a movement from the marijuana industry to give people these products of various types without appropriate safety measures. And that's my concern. I'm not here to talk about the political components. I'm talking about the safety component. And that's what you're going to hear from me tonight. This has to do with the safety. So when we have the effects of marijuana and THC specific, it creates euphoria. It stimulates appetite. It can alter perception. It can create significant increases in the cardiovascular system. Heart rate can increase from 20 to 100%. We will talk about new evidence of the impact of that on a jeopardized cardiovascular system. Risk of accidents based on, especially when it combined with other drugs such as benzodiazepines and alcohol. Thinking, cognition, executive function, those types of things. So we've known this, but the higher the concentrations, the more acute effects that we're going to see. Now, according to Dr. Weiss, also, we have discovered that this receptors that we've talked about, the CB1 and CB2 receptors, affect the brain. But as we have looked at, and the research has shown us, especially out of this Canadian study, multiple levels of function within the brain are impacted. And this regulation of the brain has to do with memory and cognition and movement, pain regulation, immune function, appetite, motivation, those types of things. And so it's important to know that, yes, there is a possibility of some great things happening with appropriate research, but right now we're not real sure about what the adverse drug effects are. We also know that these receptors, these cannabinoid receptors, are located throughout our body. There's literally hundreds of thousands of these. And these are some images that shows you that we can find them in the kidney, in the lung, in the heart, the liver, the gallbladder. We can even find them in the vertebrae of the lumbar. And so the thing about it is, as we begin to see these images and the numbers of receptors, on my side, I get excited from the medical end of it, of the possibility with appropriate research of what kind of new medications could come from this that could address disease states that may affect these areas of the body. But the thing about it is, that's not what we're really going to talk about. The main system that THC affects is the endocannabinoid system. And what endocannabinoids are regulatory components within this body. And they are produced on demand. They are required. So if you get hungry, it's because of the endocannabinoid system. If you have a cold or a virus, or you got COVID-19, you will have an activation within the endocannabinoid system to help fight with the immune system to fight off that type of virus and the sickness that comes from that. And one of the problems is that endocannabinoid system can be overused. And that's one of the problems that we see. And so when we talk about this, and again, Dr. Wise mentioned this, marijuana is the most commonly used federally illicit drug in the United States. It's like Terry was mentioning, almost 32 million people 12 and older have reported use of THC within the last month. Approximately 4.8 million may meet the criteria, at least in 2019, for cannabis use disorder. And an estimated 3.5 million use cannabis for the first time. 1.4 million were between the ages of 12 and 17. I need to tell you that the development in the brain is not fully mature to around the age of 25 to 28, depending on gender. And so when people start using a substance such as THC or marijuana that contains THC, then you begin to have some changes in this brain. Now, the marijuana industry will tell you that they have low dose marijuana and have lots of CBD. And so when we look at the landscape based on the University of Mississippi evaluation of these marijuana products throughout the country, you see that there's been a gradual and a significant increase in the amount of THC. In 2017, it averaged about 15.6% versus the CBD component of it, which most states are requiring they have a certain percentage, is about 0.3%. So a very small percentage of the non-psychoactive chemicals such as CBD versus the psychoactive chemical or the euphoric causing chemical of THC. So what does this do? Well, I'm going to give you this. This is from the magazine in Denver, in Colorado, which is the first legalized state outside of California, which was in '97. But this was from Denver's Mile High magazine. And this was high THC cannabis concentrates and their scary effects on the teenage brain. And the article is well written, and it's one of those things that won a national award. In fact, it was so influential that the governor of Colorado decided that they would pass a law that would regulate further studies of the possible health effects of high THC cannabis products and the effects it may have on the adolescent and the adult. Now, if you're going to talk about concentrates, you need to know the lingo. And the lingo has to do with dabbing, has to do with a dabber, has to do with vape pens, has to do with e-nails, extracts, hash, torch. And these, again, come out of this particular article, and it explains what these look like and what they are. And the thing about it is our time is limited, so hopefully you'll have time to review these and a copy of this and the recording of this will be available to you after our presentation. The types of concentrates are called shada, butter, crumb, sugar, live rosin, distillate, wax. All types of street names are there. And the concentrates depend on where they come from and what they're about. And they can vary, y'all, from 25%. And according to some folks in the articles that you may read, can go up to 90%. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know what a 25% THC will do to a adolescent brain. We haven't had enough time to study it because we have never had these levels of concentrate available through the general population as they are now. But they can be very, very destructive in this. So what this is about is parent awareness. And I appreciate all of you being here. But if you think of your teenagers don't have the wherewithal to buy concentrates, much less a dab rib, doesn't mean they can't emphasize ways to do both. And there's multiple ways. I'll pass this. There is a website called ERWID, EROWID.org that y'all need to go look at as soon as you can. And it will tell you all the different ways that people can do different things with all types of psychoactive chemicals. Because a lot of people don't understand that these things that they use, that they can use with dabs and other things, can be homemade. And they can come actually from a lot of the things that you find in an everyday kitchen. But when we look at the use, y'all, the use of marijuana and the effects of brain health, and this comes out of a study from the American Heart Association, of all places, according to 2002 to 2019 national survey, they said that the population of above 12 used marijuana in past increased from 11% in 2002 to 18% in 2019. The potency, as I mentioned to you, of Delta 9 THC has gradually increased from 4% in 1995 to an average of 15%, as I showed you just a second ago, in 2018. The cannabinoid receptors are expressed in high density areas in the brain that involves executive function and memory, such as the hippocampus, amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the thing. So you have to be aware that when you consume these types of potencies, it affects those areas of the brain. Now, THC has also alters the changes in the adolescent brain. The main changes is it creates a delayed neural enhancement. And what that does, y'all, is alter the development of the brain, such as the pruning and the myelinization. As we go from a child brain to an adult brain, we have 18 million neurons. And by the time we get to be adult, we have about 5 million. And what happened to the rest? Well, they were pruned, and then we violated the connections so that we could function better and think better and plan better. We also alter the prefrontal cortex, which is the planning component of the brain. The hippocampus is responsible for our survival, our fight or flight. And then the endocannabinoid system is the organizational, functional part of that central nervous system that is so important in multiple functions that we have. And when you change the neural enhancements and the neural components, that's the chemistry and the electricity inside of this, you alter the function. So when we look at the new research and we look at the windows of vulnerability of THC exposure in the adolescent brain, and according to this particular article and others like it, they said that there's several responses that you see. You see an abnormal stress response. You see what we call a glial cell activation or support cell activation component. You have desynchronization of the prefrontal cortex neural networks or the planning component. You have a dysfunction in both excitatory and inhibitory balances in stimulation and depression and those, and we have an increased anxiety and increased risk of depression and excessive synaptic pruning. And that seems like very scientific, but the thing about it is, this is why high concentrations of THC create a psychosis, we believe, is because it creates an excessive pruning of the synapses prematurely, and it creates a psychotic brain. And then we have dysregulation of monoamine pathways or dopamine. And so the thing about it is, we'll try to, what does all this mean, Meryl? What does the science mean? What does it mean? Well, synthetic THC and high potency THC bind to these receptors that we talked about, and it can create hallucinations, agitation, psychosis, short-term memory loss, seizures. It can cause coagulation and blood clots and myocardial infarctions or heart attacks. And we see this in both young, old, and in between, so to speak. So they have this abnormal stress response directly as a result of this particular type of synthetic or high potency THC. When we talk about the glial cells, and again, they're the ones that help the cells inside and support the neurons capture glucose from the bloodstream and provide energy, and also help provide other electrolytes for necessary neural activity to take place. And you have to have that in order to have normal thinking. Although it's not completely understood, the way in which THC disrupts the memory and learning may be through its differential effects on this neurotransmitter release and the binding to the CBD1 receptors, which causes an alteration. And so our particular researchers said it also may change what we call the cellular mitochondria, which creates a change in glucose, which means these cells become less functional. And again, as a result of that, we have a less functional individual over time. Then we have desynchronization of the prefrontal cortex. And what this is about, y'all, it disrupts that endocannabinoid system, and it creates a differentiation in the connection of interneural connections. And what happens with that, it begins to alter in adolescence, especially slows the development structurally, molecularly, and functional alterations in all of these circuits, specific, according to the researchers, in the areas of thinking and behavior. So people change, their behavior changes. And then when we have the dysfunction in the excitatory inhibitory balance, you have an increased anxiety and depression. And I'll show you a cannabis withdrawal graph here in just a second. But the thing about it is pretty remarkable to see the significant anxiety that comes from a withdrawal from a cannabis individual that's taking cannabis on a regular basis. And then we have that excessive synaptic pruning that we see in this particular study. And you have this organization, and what happens is you create a disorganization similar to what we see in adolescents that are developing schizophrenia. And these high dose amounts of THC may create these psychotic events that we've seen many times, especially being reported more and more in ERs, that cannot be managed through traditional stabilization of psychotic events. And then the dysregulation of dopamine pathways, the loss of dopamine. What this means, y'all, is that long-term use in a person creates the worsening of any type of depression, and it can create an anhedonic state where there's no pleasure in anything with this individual over time. And so it gets to be a concern. So the mood regulators get to be changed. The new search also in JAMA Pediatrics, and they looked at a study that's executed in National Institute of Drug Abuse. Marijuana users between 12 and 17 had nearly doubled the prevalence, which was 10.7% of substance use disorders 1 year after using cannabis, compared to adolescents who used alcohol, 5.6 or 6.6. So the addiction liability as a result of increased dosing and potency actually doubles the risk for a use disorder. After 3 years, the addiction rate of cannabis among adolescents was 20%. It was 10% for those 18 to 25. And again, the data says the National Institute emphasizes how vulnerable this young brain is to these high dose cannabis products that are now available. And people are promoting them every day. They're promoting them every day. And then there's a European-based study that aimed to identify patterns of use and strongest effect of developing psychotic disorders, published in The Lancet, which is a well-respected medical journal in Europe. And it come out with these conclusions. Daily cannabis was associated with higher likelihoods of psychotic disorders compared with people who had never used marijuana, but those numbers rose nearly 5 times increased odds for daily use of high THC types of cannabis. Another disconcerting finding, those who had started using high concentration cannabis by the age of 15 showed a doubling of risk of psychotic disorders compared to those who had never used. Again, you have a drug-induced psychiatric circumstance that can lead to harm and possible death as a result of these types of situations. And then we have the effects. This is new news. The effects of marijuana on the cardiovascular risk and disease. It says with marijuana use, the most common acute reaction of humans is decrease in blood pressure resulting in cannabinoid's effects in the vascular and autonomic system. The relationship between marijuana use and elevated blood pressure, especially in heavy users, may drive long-term association with cardiovascular outcomes, although the mechanism remains to be studied. The risk of heart attack, or MI, was elevated 4.8-fold within an hour after smoking marijuana compared to non-use. A nationwide inpatient study also found that cannabis used amongst men and women hospitalized between 2004 and 2011 was associated with a 17% increased relative risk of acute ischemic stroke in this particular study. So I did a study out in Colorado, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, looking at the effects of marijuana on daily users and driving. And so we had to do physical exams on these individuals. There was 100 that they paid to come in, and they had to stop using for at least 24 hours. And they did a drug screen and amount. And so we come in, every one of those individuals, and they range from 21 to 34, young people. Every one of them had blood pressures, an average of 20 points over normal. In fact, we had to send 2 to the hospital because they were at stroke levels of cardiovascular blood pressures. And so the thing about it is a real scary thing to see the impact, and the higher the potency, the higher the concentrates, the higher the risk we have. So now I'm going to stop my share, and I'm going to let Maddie take over and talk about the neuroscience of THC. Maddie?
Thank you, Dr. Norton. So, like he said, I'm going to talk about the neuroscience of THC. This is an extensive list of the medical conditions that marijuana is approved to treat. And this includes every condition that is approved in all the states. So we have things like Alzheimer's disease that's approved in one of the states to use marijuana to treat, all the way to things like pain and neuropathy. So we can use this for pain management in place of opioids, which are another big issue right now, is trying to decrease the amount of opioids that we're using to treat pain. So there's a lot of things here that are promising that we can have more research on and hopefully use in the future as we decide, is the benefit worth the risk for all of the things that we know are coming up as risks for the use of marijuana. There are a variety of cannabinoids that are found in the marijuana plant. The endocannabinoids are a variety of this that are found in your brain and in your body. These are things like the chemicals listed below. Phytocannabinoids are the ones we're more familiar with that are found in marijuana. These are found in plants, THC, CBD, things of that nature. There are a variety of others that aren't as popularized for their medicinal use, but they're there. And then we have synthetic cannabinoids that are made in the lab that mimic the phytocannabinoid effects, things like nabilone and other chemicals like spice that are synthetic in nature. The endocannabinoid system is in your body. There are receptors found all throughout your body that the THC or CBD binds to when it's ingested or inhaled. And that's how you have the effect that you expect from that medication or product. So CB1 is the receptor that THC binds to. THC is the psychoactive chemical in marijuana. And like you would imagine, CB1 receptors are mainly found in your brain. And so that's why you have that psychoactive effect from THC. But then we look at CBN and CBD, which do not have psychoactive effects, and they're found all throughout the body. And they give you some of the other medicinal effects like pain management that you would expect when you find them throughout the body, as opposed to being concentrated in one area. The CB1 cannabinoid receptor is found in a few different brain regions. And so we see different effects from molecules binding to these receptors. The red areas are abundant CB1 receptor expression, and the black ones are less CB1 expression. So the main one that I wanted to point out on this slide is the cerebral cortex and the prefrontal cortex. So this is where you make your decisions. These parts of your brain are in charge of higher cognitive functions, like making decisions and judging right from wrong. And so if you compromise those areas of your brain, you could imagine that it's difficult to make decisions based on your morals and, what you understand and believe to be true or right or wrong. So CB2 receptors affect your immune system modulators. And these are things like your spleen, tonsils, thymus gland. Get those back up there. And here we see that it can affect your immune system and enhance it if you are taking it in the right amount that you want to be using. But if you're taking a lot of it, it can have the opposite effect and start suppressing your immune system. There are over 100 cannabinoids in the marijuana plant, like Dr. Norton said. I think he said over 120 now have been found. Most of them are not psychoactive like THC is. But we see here when you have so many different chemicals all having different effects, you get an entourage effect. And they throw this term around a lot when talking about marijuana because we know how THC works somewhat. We have more research now to know how it affects the brain, how it affects your judgment and, different processes in your body. We kind of know how CBD works. But when you start adding in CBN, CBDV, CBC, all of these together in varying concentrations, acting together at the same time, we don't know how that works. We don't know the therapeutic potential. We don't know the adverse effects in this specific concentration of this specific product because we've only tested it when it's very concentrated over here by itself. And so this is where we run into a lot of the heart cardiovascular effects like tachycardia, high blood pressure that we do not want to see. This shows the difference in marijuana and hemp. There's a lot of different terms in the world of marijuana, but marijuana is typically associated with THC, and that's that psychoactive chemical. It does have medicinal value, and it's typically grown in a greenhouse. CBD is found a lot of times grown outdoors, and it's not psychoactive. It also has medicinal value and has different approved uses. I'll show you some specifics in a second, right here. So this shows a bunch of different cannabinoids. THC being the only one here that intoxicates or has that psychoactive, stimulating, euphoric effect when you ingest it. These are some possible medicinal applications for each of these. And so you see here, each of these has their own unique medicinal application that are being investigated. And THC, the big one that it's currently being used for is nausea and vomiting associated with chemotherapy. That's a great use for THC right now, but CBD is oftentimes used for epilepsy or seizure disorder, and there are others that they're being researched to be used for. So these are some different properties of THC and CBD. THC has psychoactive properties, but also has analgesic or pain relieving properties, as well as anti-inflammatory. This is what you would expect to be seen when you take Tylenol or ibuprofen. Euphoria, like I said, anti-tremor and appetite stimulant. That's what we want when you're, experiencing chemotherapy or cancer. You want something to stimulate your appetite. But then with CBD, we see some of the same effects and some not similar to THC. So Delta-9 THC is the full chemical name for it. We have Delta-8 THC now, you might have heard, which is just another form of this that Dr. Norton's going to talk about later, versus CBD. So this shows the chemical constituents of cannabis. So you see here a list of a lot of different chemical classes, right? Well, when we talk about THC, that is one chemical that's found within the marijuana plant. And this kind of goes back to that entourage effect, like I said, but this goes even further to show that there are many different chemical classes within the marijuana plant. And we're not just talking about the concentrated form that's found in a prescription for, marijuana that you dispense in a pharmacy. That's just THC. But when you smoke the marijuana plant, you get everything that's in that plant along with the THC. So Delta 9 is that active ingredient in marijuana, and it has two major metabolites. So when you ingest it, you inhale it, you eat an edible, your body breaks it down into two different metabolites, one of them being 11-OH-THC, which is the active isomer, and the other one is THC-COOH, which is inactive. 11-OH-THC is the main one we're concerned with here because it has activity in the body and in the brain at those receptors that I showed you. These are the different cannabinoids in their different metabolite forms. This is that 11-OH-THC versus the COOH. Your body just metabolizes these to help excrete it and also put it into its inactive form so that it can be excreted. When we talk about pharmacodynamics, I had a whole class on this in pharmacy school, but this is how the drug acts in your body. It causes a disinhibition of your dopamine neurons. So that it does this by inhibiting GABA neurons in your brain. And this causes that euphoria and relaxation that you expect when you use marijuana, a feeling of well-being, grandiosity, you think you're invincible, and an altered perception of the passage of time. Those are a lot of the big effects we see here in the pharmacodynamics. It is an agonist at CB1 and CB2 receptors. And those are the receptors that I showed you in that image all throughout your body, especially in your brain. And when we talk about smoking versus ingestion by, eating it, smoking has a much faster effect and high that you expect because of the way that it is taken in to your body and metabolized. And this produces a rapid change in your heart rate and diastolic blood pressure. It also dries up your mouth and your throat, that cotton mouth feeling, and decreases your respiratory rate. All things that can lead to some more serious side effects if you continue using. So it rapidly is increased in your plasma and is stored in your fatty tissue as well as your blood. It's detectable within seconds and has a rapid onset and a rapid decrease in effect. When we talk about oral ingestion, it has a much slower systemic absorption, more like 1 to 2 hours, can be longer depending on the concentration in the edible. And it is extensively metabolized by the liver and can be detected in drug screens for this reason, because those metabolites stay in your body for a while. So with the metabolism, these are the two metabolites like I talked about. The 11-OH-THC peaks in a few minutes, but then it's metabolized to this inactive form that peaks in a few hours. And then it's metabolized to glucuronide, which is what it is excreted as. The liver metabolizes it with cytochrome P450s, which are just enzymes in the liver that metabolize your food and drugs. Okay, now I'm going to talk about edibles. These are some images of edibles that can be homemade or bought online or in shops where it is legal. A lot of times it's candy or cookies. We got Butterfinger, Trichrome Crunch, Puffamint Patty, Rasta Reese's, all kinds of things. So dabs are a very concentrated form of marijuana. To dab or not to dab. This is a dab rig where you heat it up with a torch and have this on a stick. This is the dab or wax that you press to it and inhale here, and the smoke comes up. And this is a very concentrated form of THC. It's created through butane extraction. So you pretty much blast butane through a steel or glass tube that has the cannabis in it that's dried, and it dissolves into the butane, and that solution leaves the tube and is filtered in a dish or tray. Once that evaporates, it leaves a resin, and it can have a concentration up to 80% THC, which is insanely high when we start thinking about how in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, it was less than 5% THC that you were seeing that was recreationally smoked. And you can see here the progression of the THC content that has steadily increased to be what it is today. There are new types of concentrates as well. I told you about dabs or wax. There's keef, which is like a powdery concentrate of marijuana, water hash, rosin, butane hash oil. That's what I was showing you. A lot of times they call it earwax, but this is what it looks like, up to 95% THC, and is advertised readily online and in magazines that promote that type of thing. So vaping has brought back a lot of the decrease in use that we were seeing, but now with this new form of use, we're seeing a lot more adolescents and teenagers using it through a vape. It's more readily accessible and can be hidden from public use. When you're walking around with a vape pen that you can't smell, you don't see them smoking a joint. It looks like they're just smoking nicotine. So adolescents who vape cannabis are at a greater risk for respiratory symptoms like lung injury than teens who smoke cigarettes or marijuana. So the vaping concentrates the liquid that's already a concentrate of marijuana. It is concentrating it in a very high density smoke that is inhaled deep in the lungs and can lead to more injury than just smoking it. And this is a big topic that Dr. Norton and I have been talking about lately. The danger in fertility with marijuana that I hadn't heard of before. So, when you're born as a female, you have a certain number of eggs that you carry with you until, you have your menstrual cycle and you have babies with those eggs, but you have the same eggs that you had your whole life. So when a female smokes THC, those eggs are exposed to the THC, and that psychoactive ingredient can impair the ability to produce viable embryos from those eggs and are significantly less likely to result in a viable pregnancy. And this is very sad news for people who have smoked marijuana and maybe have stopped, or they have continued use not knowing this, because this is a lasting effect that can affect you well into the future when you have stopped smoking marijuana. These two graphs show marijuana use in pregnant females in California and shows you how much that has increased when it comes to specifically pregnant females smoking marijuana. And so on the left, you see here that this is the number of positive self-reports and positive toxicology screens of pregnant women. And those numbers are very high. The number of positive toxicology reports is higher than the number of positive self-reports because a lot of women in these situations don't want to admit that they're using marijuana, but on the toxicology, it shows that they are. And it's most prevalent among mothers who are under 18, unfortunately. Here we just see that the dopamine receptors in the unborn fetus are diminished because the mother has been using marijuana. And so The binding ability in the striatum and amygdala, those are just areas of the brain, is diminished because of that. And this is an amazing chart. I know we're running out of time here, so I'm not going to go through every single word, but this shows throughout the fetus's life how they are affected by the fact that their mother used cannabis while they were in the womb. Everything from a lower birth weight to ADHD and problems with executive function, that judgment ability, and early onset substance use disorder. This again shows the effect that nicotine has on the unborn fetus, with decreased egg quality and faster egg loss, earlier menopause, ectopic pregnancies that often end in death of the fetus, and decreased sperm quality that leads to lower rates of fertility. THC can also lead to delayed ovulation of between 1.7 to 3.5 days, which can again lead to decreased fertility and increased chances of miscarriage, premature birth, and low birth weight. This study showed that in people under 18 that used cannabis, it decreased the connectivity in the brain. So your brain talks to different parts through connections, and that's how it communicates and performs functions and makes decisions. This connectivity was decreased in adolescents who used marijuana. So that's huge to know about, be able to tell adolescents. So here we see the question, is THC toxic? You know, we talk about overdoses for a lot of medications and drugs. For marijuana, the argument a lot of times is, well, you can't overdose on it. And this study showed here in 2009 that 10 times the effective dose of alcohol could be fatal, whereas more than 1,000 times the effective dose of marijuana is possibly fatal. The toxic dose would have to be extremely high, in literal kilograms instead of grams. So that is something we do have to consider when we talk about the safety of it. But the tachycardia, or the fast heart rate that's produced by an acute intoxication, combined with, you know, the altered senses and your high blood pressure that can be caused by this, can lead to some toxic effects. The CNS and respiratory depression are also notable at high doses and can be severe and life-threatening, especially in people with pre-existing cardiac irregularities. This just shows that cell destruction also occurs with THC use and can suppress immune function. Like I said, your ability to fight off infection is compromised when we talk about cell death that's occurring because the THC is binding with the receptor, and downstream effects that occur that are disrupting cell cycles and causing cell death. This shows a comparison of an adolescent brain, 2-year history of daily abuse of marijuana versus a normal brain. And you can see here there's some obvious deficits in the prefrontal and temporal lobes that have to do with executive function. These are some symptoms of cannabis withdrawal. And the ones I wanted to highlight here are trouble sleeping, insomnia, feeling angry or aggressive and irritable. That's a big one we see with cannabis withdrawal. Feeling anxious or nervous, and change in appetite. So here we kind of see the breakdown over the days after cessation of use or stopping use of marijuana. We see some insomnia and decreased appetite in the beginning, but this irritability and anger and aggression take over when we start talking about further into the future, days later. That's the big effect that we see. And these are some drug interactions of THC. When we use marijuana with stimulants like cocaine or amphetamine, that can just increase the prevalence of the cardiovascular effects like high heart rate and blood pressure. Depressants like benzodiazepines and alcohol increase drowsiness and CNS or brain depression. And then with alcohol, it just decreases your function, and you're less likely to react appropriately to situations. I'm going to hand it back over to Dr. Norton to finish this up.
let's talk about Delta 8 a second. People ask me about Delta 8 and situation with Delta 8, and there's a lot of legality and a lot of concerns and other things, but I'm just going to give you the science and the background. When you look at cannabidiol or CBD, it is an inactive form. It creates no euphoria because it doesn't affect the CB1 or CB2 receptor. But you can very easily convert it into Delta 8, Delta 9, Delta 10 THC, which are psychoactive. And a lot of people claim that it's not illegal, but it is illegal under the federal law because it is a Delta 8, a Delta 9, and a Delta 10, which are derivatives under federal law because of the psychoactivity. And so if you look at how people do this, and in the industry that they're in, they take a CBD, which there's a glut of CBD oil on the market because people wanted it, but now they said, no, I don't, it's too expensive, I don't. So there's a big glut because a lot of people got into the business. And this is a breakdown of the different conversions that you can go with CBD oil and convert it into, as you'll look over, to Delta 9, to Delta 8, to Delta 7, to Delta 11, to Delta 10, which are derivatives of psychoactive cannabinoids, but it comes from CBD. And so a lot of this says, well, because it's CBD and CBD is a non-psychoactive and it's legal, they make the derivative. Well, the derivatives are not legal from the standpoint of the federal law. Under state law, the answer to that in the state of Georgia, yes, it is legal. It is a milder form of Delta 9. But the thing is, regardless of the legality, y'all, because of the politics or whatever, again, from the standpoint, the difference is when you got Delta 9, it has a double bonded carbon on the side of the molecule here. It's on the right side, and that's a Delta 9. Delta 8 is on the left side, if you can see the difference. So the potency is about 75% of Delta 8, Delta 8 or Delta 9. So Delta 8 is the milder version of Delta 9. And that's why a lot of people say, well, it's a much better product and I'll use it. And that's why this is going to do this. It still affects the endocannabinoid system, as we've already talked about. And this is a picture that shows you the collective components of the endocannabinoid system and the homeostasis, the balance of your energy, your stress recovery, your food intake, your metabolic homeostasis, your cardiovascular effects, your hormonal effects, your immune system, neuroprotection effects, and all of those types of things. It is a huge system that regulates body systems enormously. And so when you start altering those endocannabinoids, you alter those systems with regular use, then you can read into some problems. So then we end up with Delta 8 in a vape form. We have the oil, we have all the inhalations, and you have to take a liquid now, an oil, and when you vaporize it, it turns it into the gas. And when you have a gas, it has different properties. And what we see with the Delta 8 and the THC, they impact lung tissue very rapidly and create severe and can create very severe lung diseases. And if somebody is vaping THC, as we've seen earlier, and also gets COVID-19, we've got a major problem medically from that standpoint. So you see that the issue is the danger that people can run into with these adverse drug effects. But unlike CBD, Delta 8 produces euphoria. It's a milder form of THC, Delta 9. And it is the craze where the oversupply of CBD was available, as I said, and the producers looked at ways of how to get it and make it profitable. So they came out with Delta 8, and you will see soon Delta 10 and Delta 7 and Delta 11. And all of these things you're finding in what we call the gas station drugs. And it's one of those things that we'll see. So there's no regulatory insight. There's no laboratory testing. There's no labeling that will tell you what would happen if I have allergic reaction to Delta 8. They contain different percentages depending on which bottle you get. They have certain things. Several states have cracked down. Alabama has made it illegal, where Georgia it's legal, and other states it's legal. But the thing about it is, as long as they're derived, from hemp, people claiming no more than 0.3% of delta 9 on dry weight, the limit under federal law, many lawyers in hemp industry consider it legal. Well, under federal law, that is not the case. But the thing about it is, that's a debate for the legality. I'm not talking about legality. I'm talking about side effects. And so what are the side effects? Well, when we look at pregnancy, very similar to what Maddie talked about, it is a cannabinol. So what we have is we can have an impairment of fallopian motility. We can have ectopic pregnancies. We can have non-hatched, non-viable embryos. We can have decreased uterine receptivity. You can have spontaneous abortions. Do you see this in the literature about Delta 8? You can have a folic acid uptake. THC interferes with the folic acid, which is low folic acid during pregnancy is known to be associated with neurotube defects and low birth weight. You can have alteration in cellular growth. You can have alterations in neural development, as I've already mentioned. What about nursing infants? If they're smoking Delta 8, it passes into the breast milk and can affect that newborn in a way. In one study of 136 breastfeeding infants, it says at 1 year, in 68 infants exposed to cannabis during the first month of life, there was evidence of decreased motor development at 1 year. What really gets me about this is no one wants to listen to this until there's a problem. And then there's a problem when a mother comes in with a baby such as this, and they have no or limited payment capabilities, and they want to know, why can't you help and it's preventable. All I'm telling people is to read what these things can do before you make those choices. And that's what parents need to be talking to their kids about, is making these choices that can affect your neurodevelopment as well as your possible offspring in years to come in a significant way. There's no free lunch here. There's no free lunch. And one of the things I tell people is, how about it? So as we close tonight, because our time is extremely limited, these are some updated informational resources that I will give you that I think will be helpful. People that want to debate the issue of marijuana with me, I'm fine to debate it if they read the literature and they talk about it in a sensible and scientific way, but I'm not here to debate whether or not it's one or the other or whatever. But here are some informational things for parents who want to give their kids educational materials that will be helpful. This is also a website I added this to about people wanted to know about CBD and Delta 8, whether or not it's legal or does it have THC or whatever. These are some websites of laboratories that do testing. And these labs don't just do CBD and marijuana testing, they do testing on all drugs, whether or not, because there's a lot of pharmaceuticals. We're having a scam in pharmaceutical medicine that people are buying drugs from internationally, and they're bringing in and they say they have blood pressure medicine or diabetic medicine, and they don't have any of those drugs inside at all. They look alike. And then we end up finding out that they have fentanyl or other drugs that they shouldn't have in them. And so these are the labs that test for that. So if you're interested, there you go. These are your references. I put as many references as I could. If people are interested in looking at these particular scientific journals, that way I can help you with that and also provide information. So now I'm going to stop the share. And if there's any select questions,